Olivia's eyes snapped open to the sound of her alarm, the shrill beeping invading the silence of the early morning. For a moment, everything seemed normal, too normal. The faint light of dawn peeked through the curtains, casting long shadows across her bedroom. She lay still for a moment, trying to shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, drawing her attention. A notification lit up the screen, October 24th. Her stomach churned. She was sure it had been October 24th yesterday, too. Olivia rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that gnawed at her. She swung her legs out of bed, the cold floor beneath her feet sending a shiver up her spine. The house was still, too quiet, save for the distant creak of floorboards. Her roommate, Chloe, must have already left for work. As she moved through the house, something nagged at her, a persistent sensation like a memory trying to surface. She brushed it off as sleepiness, but the feeling followed her. Olivia glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:15 a.m. She had time before her shift at the cafe, but something about the stillness felt off. She was halfway through making her coffee when she heard it. A loud bang from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat, and her head snapped toward the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. Chloe had left, hadn't she? Taking a cautious step toward the stairs, Olivia called out, "Chloe, you still here?" No answer. The silence in the house thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She slowly ascended the stairs, her pulse quickening with each step. The air grew colder, more oppressive, and the faint scent of something metallic filled her nostrils. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob to Chloe's room. She had heard something, someone, up here. The door creaked open, and Olivia stepped inside. The room was empty, but the bed was wrong. Sheets were strewn about, as if someone had struggled. There were dark stains splattered across the pillow. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat. Blood! Before she could process the sight, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. Another notification. October 24th, 7:25 a.m. Her fingers went numb. She stumbled back, dropping the phone. It clattered to the floor as a deafening sound erupted from downstairs. The unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Olivia froze, her body locked in terror. She wanted to run, but something was keeping her rooted in place, her feet unwilling to move. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos, when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from below. Someone was in the house. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she ran down the stairs, straight into the kitchen, her heart pounding in her ears. Her eyes darted to the back door, where shattered glass littered the floor. The cold breeze from outside chilled her to the bone. There was no sign of anyone. But then the footsteps started again, this time right behind her. She turned, her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood at the entrance to the kitchen, cloaked in shadow, their face obscured. They didn't move, just stood there, watching her. "Who are you?" Olivia's voice cracked with panic. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. A deep, unsettling chill ran down her spine. She backed away, but her foot caught on something, and she tumbled to the floor. Her heart hammered in her chest as she scrambled backward, her eyes never leaving the figure. But just as they reached her, looming above with menacing silence, everything stopped. Olivia jolted awake in her bed, drenched in sweat. Her alarm blared beside her. The room was bathed in the soft light of dawn. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. October 24th, 7 a.m. The same day. Again. And the terror was only beginning. Olivia sat up in bed, her breath shallow and ragged. Her pulse raced as she glanced around her room, her eyes wide with disbelief. Everything looked the same, too much the same. The faint morning light, the smell of brewing coffee drifting from the kitchen, the distant hum of traffic outside. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it was just a vivid nightmare. But when she opened them again, her phone was still there, still flashing that date. October 24th, 7 a.m. Her skin prickled with the sensation of déjà vu. She tried to shake it off, but the memory of the figure, the blood, the broken glass, it was too real. Her heart clenched as fear sank its claws deeper into her mind. She reached for her phone, checking for any signs of a glitch. None. The time was ticking forward like it always did, but she was trapped in yesterday. Or was it today? She didn't know anymore. Forcing herself out of bed, Olivia moved mechanically through her morning routine, her mind struggling to focus on the present. She told herself it had to be a coincidence. She was just tired, overworked maybe. She had pulled double shifts at the cafe last week, after all. But as she descended the stairs, that creeping dread returned. The silence of the house was deafening. She reached the bottom step, her foot hesitating. Should she call Chloe? Check on her? Olivia's heart pounded at the thought of walking into Chloe's room again, seeing the blood, hearing those footsteps. She couldn't do it. Not again. Instead, she headed straight for the front door, determined to leave the house behind. The air outside felt cool, refreshing even, but it did little to quell the rising panic in her chest. She walked quickly, her eyes scanning the street for anything unusual. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant chatter of morning commuters, felt amplified, like the world itself was mocking her. As she rounded the corner, the cafe came into view. The usual crowd bustled around inside, a sense of normalcy that almost made her relax. Almost. Olivia forced a smile as she walked inside, greeted by the familiar clatter of dishes and the steady hum of conversation. It all felt normal, but the hairs on the back of her neck refused to settle. "Hey, Liv," her coworker Sarah called from behind the counter, oblivious to Olivia's growing paranoia. "Rough night." Olivia forced herself to nod, trying to act like everything was fine. She stepped behind the counter and grabbed an apron, her hands trembling slightly. Sarah chatted away, but Olivia's mind was elsewhere, replaying every terrifying moment of the morning. The blood, the figure, the footsteps. An hour passed. Nothing happened. Another hour. Still nothing. Maybe it had all been a dream. Maybe today really was different. Olivia allowed herself to believe that for a fleeting moment, but then it happened. An unmistakable shift in the air. A low, metallic creak from the back of the cafe. Olivia's heart stopped. She glanced at Sarah, who hadn't seemed to notice. The sound came again, louder this time. She had to check. She couldn't just ignore it. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the back storage room, the creaking now persistent, like something or someone was moving around in there. The door stood slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of light across the floor. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The room was empty, but there, in the center of the floor, was a single dark stain. Blood. Fresh. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she took a step back. She turned to leave, but froze when she heard it again. Those same heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the hallway behind her. "No," Olivia whispered, her body paralyzed with fear. It was happening again. She forced herself to move, sprinting back through the cafe, her heart in her throat. She burst through the front door, the bell above it clanging loudly, drawing startled glances from the customers. But Olivia didn't care. She ran, desperate to escape the unseen horror that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the park, her lungs burning, her mind racing. She collapsed onto a bench, her chest heaving. The world felt warped, unreal, as if she were floating in some distorted nightmare. That's when her phone buzzed again. The screen lit up. October 24th, 7 a.m. Her blood ran cold. Olivia looked up, the world spinning around her. The light of dawn was back. The same park, the same stillness in the air. Everything had reset. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not again." As the realization washed over her, a familiar sound sent her heart into a frenzy. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her mind screamed for her to run, but something was wrong. Something different this time. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, someone breathed in her ear, "You can't run from this." Olivia screamed and woke up in her bed. Her phone buzzed. October 24th, 7 a.m. The day had started over. Again. Olivia shot upright in bed, her scream still echoing in her ears. Her chest heaved, her body drenched in cold sweat. The alarm blared beside her, the harsh beeping pulling her further into the horrific reality she could no longer deny. It's happening again. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to grasp at something, anything, that might tell her this time would be different. But no, everything was the same. The same light streaming through the curtains, the same ticking clock on the wall, the same date flashing on her phone. October 24th, 7 a.m. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. How many times had she woken up like this? Was it really only the third loop? Or had she been trapped in this hell for much longer? Time had lost all meaning. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to stop the flood of panic. This can't be real, she muttered to herself, her voice cracking. This can't be happening. But it was real. The terror felt too raw, too vivid to be anything else. The memory of the footsteps, the blood, that sinister voice whispering in her ear. It was no nightmare. It was her life now, her prison. She stumbled out of bed, her legs weak, and moved mechanically through the motions of getting dressed. There was no point in calling Chloe, no point in asking for help. No one would understand. Olivia had to figure this out on her own. She had to find a way to break the loop. Her mind raced with possibilities as she hurried down the stairs. But each thought was more desperate and disjointed than the last. What if it wasn't a glitch in time, but something else? Something darker? What if this was some kind of punishment? Or worse, some malevolent force toying with her, feeding on her fear? A sharp knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Olivia froze. Her heart leapt into her throat. Someone was outside. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, but instead, she forced herself to approach the door. She peeked through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. A delivery man stood on the porch, holding a plain brown package. His face was blank, expressionless, like he wasn't really there. Olivia hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. This had never happened before. She opened the door cautiously, the hinges creaking in protest. The delivery man handed her the package without a word, his eyes glassy, unblinking. Olivia took the box, her fingers trembling. Thanks, she muttered, but the man didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, disappearing down the street as if he had never been there at all. Olivia stared down at the box in her hands, her mind swirling with dread. There was no label, no address, just her name scrawled in jagged black letters. Her stomach turned. She took a deep breath and opened it. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a small, antique-looking key. The metal was tarnished, the edges worn, as if it had been used countless times before. Olivia's heart raced as she turned it over in her hands, inspecting every inch of it. There was something etched into the metal, a symbol she didn't recognize. It was circular, with strange interlocking lines that made her head spin just looking at it. What was this? Who had sent it? And why now, in the middle of this nightmare? Before she could think further, her phone buzzed. She jumped, nearly dropping the key. It was a text. Chloe, Liv, I need to talk to you. Urgent? Her stomach lurched. Chloe? She hadn't spoken to her all morning. She was supposed to be at work. Olivia glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. The time had changed. Something was different this time. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and sprinted upstairs to Chloe's room. Her hand shook as she knocked on the door, the wood cold beneath her fingers. Chloe, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tightly shut. But there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Chloe. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Chloe was facing away from her, her head tilted slightly downward, her hair hanging loosely over her shoulders. Chloe, Olivia said again, this time louder. Slowly, Chloe turned to face her. Olivia's blood ran cold. Chloe's eyes were wide, unblinking, and her skin was as pale as death. But the worst part, the part that sent a scream clawing up Olivia's throat, was her mouth. It was stitched shut. Thick black thread ran across her lips, pulling them tight into a grotesque, silent scream. Olivia stumbled back, her knees buckling beneath her. "No, no, no," she whispered, her mind reeling with horror. Chloe stood, moving with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if her limbs were being controlled by invisible strings. Her head snapped to the side, those dead eyes locking onto Olivia. Then, in a hoarse, muffled voice, barely audible through the stitches, Chloe whispered, "It's not just you." Olivia's scream tore through the house. But before she could process what was happening, the room shifted, twisted around her like a kaleidoscope of dark shapes and shadows. Her vision blurred, and the floor seemed to drop out from under her. And then, she woke up, back in her bed. Her phone buzzed. October 24th, 7 a.m. This time, Olivia didn't move. She couldn't. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her body shaking uncontrollably. But then she noticed something different. Clutched in her hand, tightly wrapped around her fingers, was the key from the box. This wasn't just a nightmare. The loop was changing, and she wasn't alone. Olivia lay in bed, gripping the key so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stared up at the ceiling, unable to move. The room felt too still, too quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The key's cold metal pressed against her palm, a tangible reminder that something was shifting in this endless loop of terror. Each time the day restarted, things grew more twisted, more horrifying. But this time the key was here. And Chloe, what had happened to her? Olivia forced herself to sit up, clutching the key tighter. She had to move. She had to do something. But what? Was this key the answer? The way out? Or was it another piece of this sick game she was trapped in? She rose from the bed, her legs trembling as she moved toward the door. Everything around her felt surreal, like she was walking through a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. The hallway stretched before her, dark and foreboding, as if it had grown longer overnight. Every step echoed, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The memory of Chloe's stitched mouth and those lifeless eyes flashed through her mind. Olivia's stomach churned, but she pressed on, gripping the key tighter with every step. She made her way down the stairs, the house unnervingly quiet. No creaking floorboards, no distant sounds from outside, just that oppressive silence. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. If the loop was changing, if Chloe's terrifying transformation was real, then that meant someone or something was doing this to her. But who? Why? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low creaking sound. Her body stiffened. It was coming from the basement. The door to the basement stood ajar, the shadows spilling out like black ink, stretching across the floor. Olivia had never noticed the door before. Had it always been there? Or had it appeared only now, as part of this ever-shifting nightmare? The key burned cold in her hand, almost as if it were urging her forward. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I have to find out," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the thick air. She moved toward the basement door, every fiber of her being screaming at her to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to run. She was trapped in this loop, and until she found the source, the horror would keep repeating. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob. She pushed the door open wider, revealing the steep, narrow stairs that descended into darkness. The creaking grew louder as the shadows seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of her vision. Olivia hesitated at the top of the stairs, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. There was something wrong down there. She could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. But she had no choice. She had to keep going. Slowly, carefully, she descended the stairs. The darkness swallowed her with each step, the walls closing in as she moved deeper into the basement. The cold air smelled damp, like rot and decay, and a faint, metallic scent lingered in the air. The same smell she'd noticed before. Blood. Her fingers brushed against the rough stone walls as she moved, the only thing keeping her grounded in the oppressive darkness. The key in her hand felt heavier with each step, as if it was pulling her deeper into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself standing in a narrow hallway. It stretched on for what seemed like miles, the faint light at the end barely visible through the gloom. Olivia's heart raced. This basement was impossibly large, far too vast to belong to her house. It shouldn't have existed at all. But then again, none of this should be happening. She moved forward, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. As she neared the end of the hallway, she could see it now, a door. Old, wooden, with iron fittings that looked ancient, like something from another century. There was no mistaking it. The key she held was meant for that door. Her breath hitched as she approached it. A low, ominous hum vibrated through the air, as if the very walls were alive, watching her, waiting. Olivia's hands shook as she brought the key to the lock, the metal cold against her skin. With a click, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was small, barely illuminated by a single, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling. The air was thick, and Olivia gagged at the rancid smell that assaulted her senses. But it wasn't the stench or the oppressive darkness that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was what lay at the center of the room. There, on the floor, was herself. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the motionless figure lying on the ground, her exact reflection. The same dark hair, the same clothes, the same bruises forming on her arms and legs from the countless falls and scrambles to escape the horrors of this loop. Her own lifeless eyes stared back at her, glassy and vacant. She couldn't breathe. Her mind spun, trying to comprehend the impossible scene before her. Was this a vision? A twisted hallucination? Or was it real? The blood pooling beneath the other Olivia's body, soaking into the stone floor, looked all too real. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor beside her own dead body. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, like they were alive, breathing with her panic. The figure on the ground twitched. Olivia froze. Slowly, the dead version of herself moved, its hand jerking upward in a grotesque, unnatural motion. Its head snapped toward her, the mouth stretching into an impossibly wide smile. Olivia stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The other Olivia's voice came out in a sickening whisper, distorted and wrong. "You're next." The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to close in. The other Olivia crawled toward her, that horrifying grin widening, black blood oozing from its mouth. Olivia scrambled to her feet, backing away in terror. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She was trapped. The other Olivia was closer now, its eyes locked onto her, unblinking as it dragged itself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood. Its voice echoed in the small space, mocking her. "You can't escape. You never will." Desperation clawed at her as she banged on the door, trying to force it open. But it wouldn't budge. The shadows around her deepened, suffocating, and the other Olivia was right behind her now. A cold hand gripped her ankle. Olivia screamed as the world around her collapsed into darkness. She woke up. In her bed, her phone buzzed. October 24th, 7 a.m. But this time, the key was gone, and so was her reflection in the mirror. Olivia lay in bed, paralyzed by fear. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, and her body heavy as if the weight of the endless, suffocating loop was finally crushing her. The horror of what she'd just experienced still clung to her like a cold, wet blanket. Her reflection, her own corpse, that distorted version of herself crawling toward her in the basement. It wasn't just a nightmare anymore. It was something far worse. Her phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She already knew what it would say. October 24th, 7 a.m. Everything had reset. Again, but something felt different this time. The atmosphere in the room had changed, as if the air itself was thick with a presence, one that was watching her. Olivia's skin prickled as she slowly turned her head toward the mirror. Her reflection was gone. The space where her face should have been stared back at her, empty and mocking. The emptiness felt alive, shifting slightly in the dim light of her bedroom. Her heart raced. The Olivia from the basement. Had she somehow replaced her? Was she still in the mirror, watching? Her thoughts spiraled into chaos. She needed to move. She needed to find out what was happening to her. But the key was gone, and her body felt like it was no longer hers. Every attempt to sit up sent waves of panic through her, but she couldn't stay in this room, not with the empty mirror staring back. With a deep breath, Olivia forced herself out of bed, her legs trembling. The familiar sense of déjà vu washed over her as she went through the motions of getting dressed, but this time, her fear was too overwhelming to ignore. She couldn't pretend that anything about this was normal anymore. The house was eerily quiet again. No creaking floorboards, no distant sounds of the outside world. The only noise was the pounding of her heart. She descended the stairs cautiously, her eyes darting around the dim hallway, half expecting something to jump out at her at any moment. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes fixed on the basement door. It was closed again, but the oppressive feeling that had permeated it the last time still lingered in the air. She wasn't going back down there. Not yet. Instead, she turned toward the front door, desperate to get out of the house. She grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic rising in her chest. Locked. She tried the latch, rattling it with growing urgency. Locked from the outside. Her breath hitched as a cold realization washed over her. She was trapped. This house, this day, this nightmare. She couldn't escape. Not like this. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating loudly in her pocket. Olivia fumbled to pull it out, her hands trembling. The screen lit up, and she stared at the message in horror. "You're not alone." The text had no sender. Her throat tightened, and she quickly glanced around, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only silence. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. Who was sending these messages? How could they know? The phone buzzed again. Another text appeared, this time more cryptic. "Look in the mirror." Olivia's blood ran cold. Her hand gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The mirror. She didn't want to. She didn't want to see what was or wasn't there. But something in her gut told her that she had no choice. Slowly, she turned and made her way back up the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of dread growing heavier with every movement. When she reached her bedroom door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. "Look in the mirror." With a deep, shaky breath, Olivia opened the door and stepped inside. The air in the room felt different now, thicker, heavier, like the very walls were closing in on her. Her eyes were drawn immediately to the mirror on the far wall, but she kept her gaze low, avoiding it as long as she could. But she couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a final breath, Olivia lifted her eyes to the glass. Her reflection was back, but something was horribly wrong. The version of herself in the mirror didn't move the way she did. It stood perfectly still, staring at her with an unnerving intensity. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, mocking smile. Olivia's stomach churned. She stepped closer, her breath shaky. The reflection didn't mirror her movement. Instead, it slowly began to move on its own, raising one hand toward the glass. Fingers splayed. Olivia's heart pounded as she watched in horror, unable to tear her eyes away. The reflection's hand touched the glass, and then, without warning, it began to push through. The surface of the mirror rippled like water as the reflection's hand emerged, the fingers curling and stretching into the room. Olivia stumbled back, her mind screaming in terror as the reflection, her own reflection, started to crawl out of the mirror, dragging itself forward with jerky, unnatural movements. "No," Olivia gasped, backing away toward the door. "This can't be real." But it was. The reflection pulled itself out of the mirror, its twisted grin widening as it stood up, towering over her. Its eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto her with malevolent glee. It didn't speak, but the atmosphere around it screamed with a wordless threat. Olivia's mind raced, trying to think, to move, to escape, but the reflection was faster. It lunged at her, its hands cold and unrelenting as they wrapped around her throat. Olivia gasped, choking as her vision blurred. She clawed at the thing, struggling to break free, but but it was too strong. Its grip tightened, and its face, her own face, twisted into something monstrous, filled her vision. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a distorted version of her own. "You are me now." The room spun, the darkness closing in, and Olivia felt her body growing weaker, the life draining from her as the reflection squeezed harder, its laughter ringing in her ears. And then, just as the darkness swallowed her whole, she woke up. In her bed, her phone buzzed. October 24th, 7 a.m. But this time, something was horribly wrong. The room was darker than usual. The air was thicker, almost suffocating. Olivia sat up, her entire body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see herself, but they weren't her hands. They were the reflections. And when she looked into the mirror, the real Olivia was gone. She was trapped, inside the loop, forever.